Why do you think we see this explosion of activity in early 20th century British music? Where does it come from?
Well, it comes from two things. First of all, what I might call a natural expression of the zenith between 1900 and 1910 of the British Empire. One still has to realise that the first man on the moon spoke English. The impact and influence of Britain has been phenomenal. It may be that there is now a reaction against much of what it might or might not have been based upon, but the fact remains that English is always taught as the second language in schools throughout the world. That it comes not just through that, but also through the vast explosion in the 1960s of British pop music worldwide. Children, young people, teenagers throughout the world responded to the Beatles especially, and they learned their songs in much the same way as teenagers in England learned the songs of Bob Dylan or the early rock and roll of Elvis Presley. Now, there's no doubt that in the case of Elvis Presley especially, you had there a great musical natural genius, which was founded upon one thing and one thing only, and that was the quality of his voice. It was nothing else than that. He was a baritone that ran from low G right up to top B flat without falsetto. It was an extraordinary musical instrument, and yet he never wrote anything more important than his signature on a contract. He never wrote songs, he never wrote anything, he never became a philosophical figure. But it was that absorption of the impact of the English language. It could only be expressed through English language and through English dialect, if you like, in the case of the Beatles, because they were not Londoners. They came from a region of England that was very significant at the time. Goodness knows why these things happen. It's almost like midwich cuckoos. Suddenly they appear in one area and grow up, and you begin to think, how come that's right there? How come English folk music 50 years before was based essentially upon Eastern England? You don't get English folk music from Cornwall. You don't get English folk music from Lancashire, though there are folk tunes from those regions. But most of it came from that area. Why did Vaughan Williams, Percy Grainger and others, Young especially, go there to find and take down almost from dictation the folk music of the ethnic country? It wasn't confined necessarily to England either, because 20 years before that, Grieg was doing the same thing in Norway in 1890. He was going around in a handcart pulled by a donkey, taking down musical dictation, Norwegian folk songs from his fellow countrymen. But why should he do that? In 1890, he was an extremely wealthy man. His lyric pieces were played all over the world and sold literally in their millions. There's something driven about the ethnic folk music of countries that may indeed have arisen with the rise of nationalism. In Grieg's case, for example, it was that, because in 1905, finally Norway broke away from Denmark and voted by 95% to have a monarchy, would you believe? When you talk about the modern day demographics. It's extraordinary that that country did that, but it did that as an establishment of nationalism, of throwing away a realization of what a country has to offer. In exactly the same way, certainly in other parts of Scandinavia, that you found in Finland with Sibelius and his obvious musical depiction of Finlandia and things like that. It became almost fashionable, in the best sense, to find out what we have that makes us us. And in England, although it certainly had by the dawn of the 20th century, two great music colleges, the Royal Academy, which was founded in 1822, and the Royal College 60 years later. But it had that feeling that we have expanded our influence. And therefore, what is it that we have that may be in danger of being lost because of the growing Industrial Revolution? And the Industrial Revolution occurred in England before it did anywhere else. It's that expansion of national awareness, reawakening. It wasn't just in England, but it produced and enabled composers such as Parry, such as Stanford, such as Ireland, for example, and other composers, but to find their natural musicianship encouraged in a way that had not been true 50 years earlier. It just wasn't encouraged. And it was true not only in England, but in other countries too, where this emerging nationalism found expression. Russia, for example, the second half of the 19th century, you had an explosion of musical geniuses. One great composer after another.
When we ask ourselves, what is it about certain composers that makes them often referred to as quintessentially British? Composers like Vaughan Williams, or Ivor Gurney, or Gerald Finzi. Do you think that has a lot to do with the fact that their music often at least refers to these very things, folk song, landscape, things that are built into the nation? Do you think that's what makes them quintessentially British?
It probably does. That's a very good point. Because there are two other great composers you could have mentioned but didn't. One is Elgar and the other is Britten. Both of whom had found great inspiration in those parts of the country from which they came. Britain, obviously, Peter Grimes and East Anglia. Elgar in the West Country. And it's very interesting that Gerald Northrop Moore, a fellow American who's lived here for many, many years and has written knows more about Elgar than Elgar himself knew about himself, defined it as Elgar seemed to be searching in all of his music for the one theme that expressed what he was. And he found it in the main subject, you can't say the second subject or even the first subject of the first movement of the cello concerto. And you don't hear it on the cello. You hear it on the violas. It's a distant sound. He said it's almost like the musical depiction of the Malvern Hills that he must have seen as a boy, because Elgar of course, never went to music college. He didn't study music like some block-headed bachelor of music who turns up these days to a penny. It was within him. He was born that way. And it may be because his father ran a music shop, that his father was obviously musical, otherwise he would have become a butcher or something else. That musicianship found within that individual Elgar that indefinable spark of genius which was able to flower and flower and flower. And you find that essentially in Britain's music. Britain is a very, very interesting figure in so many ways, and I think that the deeper aspects of Britain have certainly not yet been investigated or gone into in a way that they should, because there are so many people around who still remember him, of course, who absorb all the many things that were written about Britain during his lifetime as being the standards by which Britain's music should be judged, but it isn't. It shouldn't be. I mean, at the time of Elgar's centenary, 1957, his music was laughed at in this country. He was regarded as some old colonel, you know, yes, it's all pomp and circumstance and that's it. But it's not. It isn't. I was so amazed when I was at CBS to learn that Pinker Zuckerman wanted to play the violin concerto and recorded it with Danny. And yet one thinks back that earlier, I remember seeing Heifetz perform the Elgar Concerto over the Albert Hall in 1960 with Sir Malcolm Sargent conducting. And Menuhin, you know, son of Jewish immigrants in New York, records arguably still the greatest performance of the violin concerto at the age of 15, with Elgar conducting. It shows the inherent internationalism that music is. It is an international language which unites us all. What I'm saying through all this is that nationalism, in a sense, still is something from which it is impossible for a composer to escape. I don't think any composer can cover up or unconsciously seek to destroy his ethnic background as a creative artist.
On that note, you're a composer yourself. What role do all these elements in terms of Britishness or national identity play in your own work as a composer?
I don't think of it in those terms.
How do you think of it?
I'm able to write music. Whether it's any good or not, I don't know. I don't know. Some people like my music, other people are politely silent on it. I don't mind. When I write a piece of music, it's like having children, by which, and occasionally there's a certain amount of premature ejaculation with regard to the music. It's like having children. It's their life, not mine. As I told my son when he was 16, I said, it's your life. It's not my life, it's yours. I'm with you for you all the time. But whatever you do, is your decision. Whatever happens to you happens as a consequence of what you do, not as a consequence of what I do or what I have done. And with a piece of music, it has to take its chance. It may not be a very good piece of music. Maybe a piece of, well, it doesn't seem to say very much. On the other hand, it may be something that I think very strongly about, but I don't tell people that. They have to accept it or reject it as they think fit, as it means anything to anyone. Like writing a book. Some people like books, some people like a novel, some people would regard it as junk. But those who regard it as junk must know why it is junk. It goes back to my friend who doesn't like the turn of the screw, because he doesn't know it. He's never studied it. But he's never wanted to study it. There appears to be nothing in that score which has attracted him, which caused him to identify or to find out why he was attracted to that. What is it about Elgar's Second Symphony that attracts you? You know? That's how I came to it, through the last movement. Not because it's supposed to represent ships going, you know, the British fleet at anchor in 1914. No. There was that element of sudden toughness. And through a committed performance, that expression can leap from the instruments to the listener. And the listener suddenly realizes that what Elgar is saying is, this is life. This is what it means to be alive, to be a human being. We have all of our reactions to various events. They are maybe emotional, but they have to be at all times controlled and directed by our evolved creative intelligence. That's what makes us human beings. Animals can't do it. Human beings can.
You've talked about national identity and also about how our perception of composers changes over decades, and also about the importance of the medium that we perceive music, in the case of Owen Wingrave and television. I want to ask you about radio. In particular, I want to know what role you think the BBC has to play in the presentation of what British music is to the rest of the world.
Well, that's a very difficult question, because the BBC, as currently constituted, has no concept of what it ought to be doing. It has no concept at all. 40 years ago, I had lunch with the controller of Radio 3, who had succeeded William Glock. And I said, what new ideas did you bring to the programming and presenting of music on Radio 3? He said, Bob, he said, in my department I had Hans Keller, Derek Cook, Robert Simpson, Robert Layton, Leo Black, Lionel Salter. He said, I wasn't short of new ideas from those people. He said it's a bit like when somebody asked Sir Matt Busby, the manager of the Manchester United football team, he said, what instructions do you give your players as to how they should play? He said, in my football team, I had George Best, I had Bobby Charlton, I had Dennis Law, I had Alex Stepney. He said, I just told them to go out and play football. Today, there is no BBC music department. It doesn't exist anymore. And consequently, there are no creative figures, certainly none experienced in broadcasting, as there were then. When was the last time the BBC broadcast a talk on music? There were talks given in those days, Hans Keller on Britain, Derek Cook on Mahler, Robert Simpson on Beethoven, or Carl Nielsen or Sibelius, or it would be Robert Layton on Sibelius. He said these were experts in their field, and they were expert broadcasters. They knew what broadcasting was. And those talks that they gave were often reprinted in the regular BBC weekly journal, The Listener. The Listener doesn't exist anymore. The BBC doesn't publish the Radio Times. It's gone. The BBC was destroyed 26 years ago, by John Burt, who decided that the BBC should no longer make programmes. The programmes should be made by outside companies and bought in. And there would be people at the BBC, much reduced staff, therefore saving money or increasing their salaries, just in order to say, yes, that's a good idea, you go ahead and do that. But there was no BBC control of music. That's the tragedy. Because if the BBC doesn't broadcast, if the BBC with its 5 major international symphony orchestras doesn't perform British music, then who on earth is going to do it? It needs the 5 orchestras to be brought under one major control. They should certainly be given indigenous independence. There's no question about that. Hopefully, reflecting the diversity of the part of the country in which they live. BBC Scottish Orchestra, you expect them to play occasionally rather more music by Scottish composers than the BBC Welsh would do. But the BBC Welsh, would it be expected also to do that? To do the Welsh composers? I would not expect the BBC Philharmonic to be in competition with the Halle Orchestra. There's no need. If one great city can support 2 major symphony orchestras, that's fine. But London has 5. London has 5 major international symphony orchestras. It has 5 major international chamber orchestras. It has 5 major international colleges of music. It has 2 major international opera houses. It is without question, purely on numerical terms, the world's centre for classical music. But it isn't. It isn't, because it is not under the control, under the direction of people who should know but don't. It's tragic. nowadays, it's depressing in a purely intellectual sense, to put it no lower than that, for music to be chosen on the gender of the composer, on the ethnicity of the composer, on whatever else the decision is reached by, other than the quality of the music on offer. I can understand it. I think I can understand it if I were female and a composer of 60 years of age who for the last 40 years has been battling to try and get my music performed by somebody, but it's rejected simply because I'm a woman or because I'm black or because I'm gay. That doesn't normally stand in the way of composers, or hadn't done so in the past. It just, I can understand somebody rebelling against that, reacting against that, because, as I said earlier about my own music, it's gone, it's got its own life, it's his life, it's my music's life, it's not me. If people want to play my music, who am I to stand in the way of this acclaim? And it's very nice that they do. But they should not do it because they like me. I can be a miserable bastard at times. They shouldn't do it because they think I might give them a good review in musical opinion. No, certainly not. They should do it because they think that my music is worth playing and it might mean something to their audience. They are the means. They are as Stravinsky said about the Rite of Spring, I am the vessel through which Le Sacre passed. He didn't see himself as the creator, he was merely the means by which this work came through out into the world. It's just that.
When you talk about these enormous issues in the British performance industry, in institutions like the BBC, do you see any reasons for optimism?
No. For two reasons. The first is that in 1944, while the war was still going on, we had had for 4 years a coalition government. Although Churchill was Prime Minister, it was not a Conservative government, although he was the leader of the Conservatives. Because it was a coalition government with members of the Labour Party, the Lib Dems, the Liberals said, because they were the Lib Dems in 1944. It was a national government pulling together to win the war, to defeat Hitler. That year, 1944, certainly after the halfway mark, it was obvious we were going to win it. It's going to take a time, but we were going to win. And thoughts turned to what would happen after the war. And it was decided there would be a national curriculum for schools, so that every child in the country would be taught the same thing from the age of 5 to 15. They would have the same standard educational curriculum. Music was part of that. By which I mean not learning a musical instrument. That wasn't what music meant, but the history of music. Starting with Bach, and then going on, insofar as it meant anything to British music, so that everyone would be aware of Elgar, Vaughan Williams, maybe a bit of Ireland, who knows, Britain, Malcolm Arnold, maybe. They would be aware of the thread of British music. There would only be one lesson a week, but it was part of the national curriculum. Every child was touched by that. Every child had the chance. Also, when the General Certificate of Education was brought in, you could study music at the ordinary level, but you had to be able to read a miniature score. That wasn't so difficult. You could follow a miniature score. One of the earliest ones was Britain's Young Person's Guide, for pretty obvious reasons. You know? The way it taught about the instruments of the orchestra without teaching them about the orchestra. They absorbed it. It was part of the musical experience of hearing that work. And so it continued until 2014, when Michael Gove, to his eternal discredit, removed music from the national curriculum. It's no longer taught in schools as a subject. He thought that music was the same as learning to beat drums after school hours, to become, or maybe Trinidad steel drums, or guitars. But people were not taught, and have not been taught since 2014, about music in this country. When was the last time a string quartet was shown on British television? It used to be relatively common 50, 60 years ago, certainly on BBC Two. It was in 1993 a string quartet was last shown on British television, when Channel 4, would you believe, broadcast the complete chamber music of Schoenberg. If Channel 4 were to broadcast the complete music of chamber music of Schoenberg today, it'd be a riot. There would certainly be something written about in the popular press. But what that means, has meant and continues to mean, is that since 1993, 2 or 3 generations of British children have been born and brought up without ever having seen a string quartet. They don't know they exist. I'm not suggesting that children should be sat in the school hall and forced to listen to a quartet by Bartók and a quartet by Haydn, though we might get some interesting reactions if they were. But they don't even know of its existence. Yet it is part of their heritage. It is theirs. It is free. And it belongs to them. And they are denied access to it. Consequently, you look at the audiences, the promenaders. 50 years ago, the majority of them were young, with black hair. Today, the majority of them are retired people with grey hair. That means that in 30 years' time, there won't be a promenade concert. They won't exist anymore. It would have been destroyed through downright ignorance on the part of those in charge. That's what's happened. So, if you ask me what action should the BBC take, the BBC is not organised or set up now to take those actions. Radio 3 is run by a man who is not up to the job. He has appointed a man to run the proms, which used to be the controller of Radio 3's job. A man who, for the previous 11 years of his professional existence, was running Glyndebourne Opera House. That's fine. No one should deny people the ability and the opportunity to run an opera house. But that doesn't qualify you for planning 75 orchestral concerts. What's your knowledge of the orchestral repertoire? What's your knowledge of the British orchestral repertoire of the last 50 years? Let alone the last 50 years of British chamber music. It's nothing to look forward to. It's true that when people make representations to the BBC now, occasionally those representations are taken on board, but they shouldn't be necessary. You should have the people there in situ who know what to do and do it.
There are certainly things to be pessimistic about in this music country, in the music of this country and other countries in the West. But there are countries around the world where there is a vibrant and growing classical music culture, particularly in Asia. And this interview is being done for the British Music Festival in Taiwan. And this festival will include what we think will be the first performances in Taiwan of British pieces by John Ireland, by Delius, by yourself. What do you think the significance is of this sort of a festival happening in Taiwan?
That's up to the Taiwanese, in a sense. The fact that it is happening is significant in itself. The mere fact of its existence, that it will occur, is a remarkable achievement on the part of its organisers. There's no doubt about that. And they have been sufficiently moved by their own experience of British music to realise that it's about time we heard British music in Taiwan. That part of the world is not short on musical people. Everyone surely has some ability, some inherent gift maybe, to react to music in some form. And here is an opportunity to bring aspects of British music of the last 100 years to an audience which has previously not had the opportunity of hearing it. Not because the music may or may not be worth playing, but because the opportunity simply hasn't arisen. Here it is an opportunity, and I would hope very much that musically Taiwanese people will listen and think, hey, maybe this isn't so bad after all. I'd like to know a bit more about it. And you have to start somewhere. And this, it seems to me, is a very good beginning.